Hello, and welcome to my fourth part of the Pixar problem series, in which I am discussing some problems that I feel exist within this animation company. And if this is your first time watching, I would highly recommend that you go back and watch the other parts first before watching this one, and you can find a link to the playlist in the description below. I wouldn't say you have to watch them, but I think you'll be better off in the long run if you do. And remember, I'm only offering up some constructive criticism here. I am in no way hating on the company or saying that their movies are bad. I'm not saying that at all. There may also be spoilers for some Pixar movies in this video, so if you haven't seen any of them yet, but you do plan to, you might want to be careful. Okay, what I want to talk about in this video is something called world building. Now, for those of you who don't know, world building is the development of a fictional world, usually involving the history, rules of fictional elements within the world, and sometimes even languages and cultures. Now, this is mostly restricted to science fiction and fantasy movies, with Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings probably being two of the best examples of world building in fiction. But it can really happen in any story as long as the writer wants to establish something about their fictional world that isn't a given or already exists as part of our own world. But sometimes the writers don't want to dedicate half of their movies to explaining the history of their fictional world and how it works. And that's perfectly reasonable. I wouldn't fault anybody for that. But when dealing with a fictional world, there are certain questions that will inevitably have to be addressed, otherwise the story will end up falling apart. And sometimes, Pixar doesn't address those very questions, ironically, in service of the story. But Pixar doesn't always neglect the world build, don't get me wrong, as I feel that WALL-E actually does a very good job at it. In two short scenes, you get everything you need to know. In the future, man finally builds robots, then Earth filled up with garbage, so everybody left in spaceships, and the artificial gravity turned them into giant blobs of flesh. There. Now you have everything you need to know. It's believable, it makes sense, and it allows you to focus on the story. And these two short scenes that establish all of this are probably about a minute in total. Actually, in all honesty, if you want to tell a science fiction story without wasting time on world building, that movie right there might just be the best example of how to do it. Both Coco and Monsters Inc. also do a pretty good job of believable world building as well, just for a couple of more examples. Here's the thing though, sometimes Pixar doesn't even extend it that far. They don't even give that short 1-minute scene that could explain so much. And you might also be wondering, why is this even important? So what if there's no details? Well, let me put it to you this way. The Toy Story movies are supposed to take place in the real world. That's what they establish. Basically the same world that we inhabit, except the toys are able to come to life. The problem is, though, that there are a couple of times throughout the movies that the toys influence the world to such a degree that it's impossible for the human characters to be believably living in the same world as us. I'm sorry, but people as a whole are not that oblivious. Somebody would have noticed something long before those movies ever took place. Now, a simple explanation as to why people don't notice what the toys are doing other than just plain obliviousness could easily have fixed that, but you never get one, leaving everybody to wonder what's up and feel a strange disconnect between the movie's world and our own. But in this case, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't take away from the stories at all. It just leaves an unanswered question or two. Now, basically, what I'm trying to say here is that Pixar cares so much about the story they're trying to tell that sometimes they don't bother to answer simple questions about the fictional world they've created, leaving unanswered questions that take the audience out of the movie, or even sometimes have the world suit the characters' needs at any particular moment without any thought as to how it would realistically work. And that can often lead to problems very quickly. And I can give you just one example of that. What on earth is the point of a disguising spell if you have to tell the truth while using it? That spell wasn't created to use at Halloween parties. The whole point of a disguise is that you intend on lying to somebody. Clearly the writers didn't give any thought as to the actual ramifications of such a spell, and we're only doing it because it worked for the story at that particular moment, which ends up making the spell look completely redundant if viewed within a wider context. But I'm not the only one who's taken notice of this, because it was actually a legitimate criticism among professional film critics of both Onward and the original Cars movie that there hadn't been enough world building in them. But I feel a different movie actually suffers from this the most, and it might actually surprise you. Inside Out. Now, before you take to the comments to chew me out and flame me alive, please let me explain. I believe it was Don Bluth who said about this movie that if your emotions control you and have wants and feelings of their own, then that kind of removes the idea of individuality and free will from the person they're controlling. And the thing is, I absolutely agree with that. I'd even say that the biggest problem with the movie is that Riley doesn't feel like a real person. The way it's presented in the movie, it's almost like every action she does is just a byproduct of what her emotions are telling her to do. It tries to imply that she's her own person with wants and desires of her own, but this is never shown or even that heavily implied. They never visit a place inside Riley's mind that's the real Riley, to show that she thinks independently of what her emotions are telling her, or ever show her doing something that isn't directly influenced by the emotions. Let me put it this way. You know how people have accused Joy of trying to live through Riley? Well, I honestly don't think that's a question, but only because it feels like all the emotions are trying to live through Riley and that it's essentially their job to. Look at the famous dinner scene. Riley is completely at the mercy of the emotions she has left. She reacts in complete fear to a question she has absolutely no reason to. In my opinion, I might even go as far as to say that there's nothing in the narrative that suggests that Riley is anything more than a puppet being controlled by her living, sentient emotions. So of course they're living through her. Going by this logic, they essentially are her. But all of this leads to an even bigger problem. You know how Joy spends the entire movie trying to repress sadness and eventually comes to realize that this is a bad thing? Well, from the way the movie accidentally presents itself, basically that Riley isn't her own character and is just a puppet, then Joy's actually doing a good thing. I mean, I know if I were being controlled by my sentient emotions, I'd want my happiness to repress my sadness as much as possible. In fact, if I'm being completely controlled by them anyway, why would I ever want to feel a negative emotion of any kind? And yes, I do get that the point of the movie is that you have to feel negative emotions sometimes in order to feel truly happy. But once again, I feel that this isn't properly conveyed. Because what they are probably going for is that Riley is controlling the emotions and Joy is pulling rank in a misguided attempt to keep her happy. But it ends up coming across as the other way around because the movie makes it look like the emotions are controlling her. So that's why the moral ends up lost on some people, and there are so many different interpretations of the movie and its characters. Now, what was my point with all of this? That a 1 minute scene explaining that Riley was still her own person despite her sentient emotions could have gone a long way in fixing this problem and would have probably had no impact on the overall story otherwise. Or even just dedicate some time to Riley outside of her emotions and how they directly affect her so that she seems less like a puppet and more like an actual person. All I can say is, whether or not this was a problem for you when watching the movie, I think that just a little exposition could have made the movie a lot easier for a lot of people to understand. Alright, I think that pretty much wraps up this part. And just to clarify, I wasn't criticizing any of the movies I just mentioned. I was just trying to make a point about Pixar's issues with world building. And like I've said before, if you disagree with everything I just said, that's perfectly fine. So what do you think? Do you like it when movies world build, or do you like them to just stick to the story? Feel free to let me know in the comments. But until then, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.